At 2:17 a.m., Bethany Ashford sent her 20-year-old son over my fence with bolt cutters, telling him my electric fence was just decorative lighting. The 10,000-volt shock launched Jason backward like a rag doll. A blinding flash lit up my yard. Alarms shrieked. His scream tore through the desert night. By the time I ran outside, Jason was on the ground convulsing, and Bethany was frantically checking on him while still clutching the papers she'd planned to plant on my property. All of this started because my disabled daughter needed a wheelchair ramp, and this woman decided that meant we should lose our home. What Bethany still didn't realize in that moment was that every second of her plan was being recorded, and when that footage reached the right hands, everything changed. What would you do if someone risked their own child to steal your home? Curtis Manning never thought he'd be living in a suburban HOA community. After 20 years in the Army, followed by a decade running his own security company, Curtis was more comfortable with wide-open spaces and neighbors who minded their own business. But life has a way of throwing curveballs. When his ex-wife abandoned their 15-year-old daughter Emma 3 years earlier, citing the stress of Emma's spina bifida as too much to handle, Curtis found himself needing a fresh start in a place with good schools and medical facilities. The Meadowview Heights community seemed perfect: single-story homes, wide driveways, and what appeared to be reasonable HOA rules. Curtis was 48, with graying temples and the kind of steady demeanor you get from defusing bombs in Afghanistan. These days, he installed security systems for a living, but more importantly, he was Emma's full-time caregiver. Emma was brilliant, honor roll student, debate team captain, but she needed a wheelchair for longer distances and specialized equipment at home. The smell of fresh coffee filled their kitchen that Tuesday morning in March when Curtis first encountered Bethany Ashford. He was helping Emma with her physical therapy exercises when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, he saw a woman in her 50s with perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a clipboard that screamed trouble. "Mr. Manning, I'm Bethany Ashford, chair of the Architectural Review Committee." Her voice had that sugary, sweet tone that immediately put Curtis on alert. "I need to discuss some violations with your property." Curtis opened the door, noting how her eyes immediately went to Emma's wheelchair ramp, a beautiful piece of cedar construction that blended seamlessly with the house's design. He'd built it himself, complete with proper permits and county approval. "What violations would those be, ma'am?" Bethany's smile tightened. This ramp wasn't approved by the committee. "It's a significant structural modification that affects the neighborhood's aesthetic standards." She handed him a citation. "That's a $500 fine, with additional daily penalties until it's removed." Curtis felt that familiar tingle at the base of his skull, the same one he'd gotten right before IEDs went off in Kandahar. Emma wheeled up beside him, and he could see the worry in her eyes. "I have all the permits," Curtis said calmly. "County Building Department, ADA compliance certification, HOA architectural approval from when I submitted the plans 8 months ago." "Those approvals are insufficient," Bethany said, not even glancing at the paperwork Curtis retrieved from his filing cabinet. "The current board has updated our standards. You have 30 days to remove the structure or face escalating fines." The crisp sound of papers shuffling filled the awkward silence as Curtis organized his documentation. The scent of Bethany's overpowering perfume, something floral and expensive, made his nose twitch. After Bethany left, Curtis did what any good soldier does. He researched his enemy. Meadowview Heights had 847 homes and a board of 5 members. Bethany had been chair for 3 years, during which property values had risen dramatically. Too dramatically. Curtis started noticing a pattern in the HOA meeting minutes. Certain homeowners, mostly elderly or those with disabilities, faced repeated citations while others seemed immune. He spent hours poring over county records, HOA financial statements, and architectural approval logs. The more he dug, the more questions emerged. Why were some modifications approved in days while others languished for months? Why did certain contractors seem to get preferential treatment? And why did Bethany's own property have several unpermitted additions that somehow never appeared on violation lists? Emma found him that night hunched over his laptop, scrolling through public records. The blue glow of the screen reflected off her concerned face as she wheeled into his home office. "Dad, are we going to have to move again?" Curtis looked at his daughter, remembering the 4 schools she'd already attended because of their family upheaval. Her medical equipment hummed softly in the background, machines that kept her mobile and independent. "Not if I can help it, kiddo. Sometimes people need to be reminded that just because you have a little power doesn't mean you can push people around." What Curtis didn't know yet was that Bethany's power grab went far beyond petty HOA politics. She was running something much more profitable and much more illegal. But Curtis Manning hadn't survived 2 tours in Afghanistan by backing down from bullies. The next morning, Curtis installed his first security camera. Within a week of installing security cameras around his property, Curtis caught his first break. The high-definition footage showed Bethany trespassing on his property at 6:47 a.m. on a Thursday, using her phone to photograph Emma's therapy equipment in their backyard. She spent nearly 20 minutes measuring distances and taking notes, clearly trying to find new violations to cite. Curtis had learned a valuable lesson in the military. Documentation beats confrontation every time. So instead of immediately confronting Bethany, he compiled the footage, checked his property boundaries with a surveyor, and prepared his counterattack. The second citation arrived Friday afternoon, hand-delivered by Bethany herself. This time she'd brought backup, a thin man in an ill-fitting suit she introduced as our compliance inspector. "Mr. Manning, this is about your unauthorized storage structure," Bethany announced, pointing to Emma's pool therapy equipment. The heated therapy pool and lift system had been installed by Emma's medical team and was essential for her daily physical therapy. "That's medical equipment," Curtis said evenly, "prescribed by her physician and installed by certified medical equipment specialists." Bethany's fake inspector scribbled notes on his clipboard. "Doesn't matter. Any structure over 4 feet high requires architectural approval. That's a $750 fine, plus $50 daily until removed." Curtis felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "Ma'am, I have documentation showing you photographed this equipment without permission by trespassing on my property. That's a criminal offense in Arizona." For just a moment, Bethany's mask slipped. Curtis caught a flash of something ugly, the look of someone who'd gotten used to people backing down. "I have every right to inspect properties for violations. It's in the HOA covenants." "Actually, it's not." Curtis pulled out a printed copy of the covenants, highlighted and annotated. Section 4.3 clearly states that inspections require 24-hour written notice and can only be conducted from public areas or with homeowner consent. "You were in my backyard without permission." The sound of Bethany's high heels clicking on his concrete driveway grew more rapid. A nervous tell Curtis filed away for future reference. "This is intimidation, Mr. Manning. I'm reporting this to the board as harassment." Here's where Curtis played his first card. "Please do. I'd love to discuss my findings with the full board, like how your property has 3 unpermitted additions that somehow never got cited, or how Pinnacle Landscaping gets 90% of HOA maintenance contracts despite not being the lowest bidder." Bethany's inspector suddenly found great interest in his shoes. Curtis had done his homework. Pinnacle Landscaping was owned by Bethany's brother-in-law. "You're making serious accusations," Bethany said, but her voice had lost its authoritative edge. "I'm stating facts, public record facts." Curtis handed her a manila folder. Property records, HOA financial statements, contractor bids, all available through Freedom of Information requests. After they left, Curtis called his neighbor Margaret, a retired paralegal who'd been fighting HOA overreach for months. She arrived within an hour, carrying a box of files and wearing a grin that reminded Curtis of his old sergeant when she'd found enemy positions. "Curtis, you magnificent bastard," Margaret said, sorting through his documentation. "You've stumbled onto something bigger than petty power trips. Look at these patterns." She spread HOA violation records across his kitchen table like a battle map. "See how violations spike right before quarterly board meetings? And how they're always resolved by the same 3 contractors? That's not coincidence, that's coordination." Margaret explained a legal concept Curtis hadn't considered: selective enforcement. When HOA boards apply rules inconsistently, especially targeting specific groups, they create liability for themselves. But more importantly, she'd discovered something else in the financial records. "Bethany's been charging homeowners for pre-violation consultations," Margaret said. "Look at these bank deposits, $500 here, $300 there, all cash payments from residents who mysteriously never get cited after paying up." The pieces clicked into place for Curtis. Bethany wasn't just power-hungry, she was running a protection racket. Pay her consulting fee, and your violations disappear. Refuse, and face escalating fines that could lead to foreclosure. "How many people has she done this to?" Curtis asked. "At least 15 that I can prove. Probably more who paid quietly and never reported it." Margaret's eyes gleamed with the prospect of justice. "Curtis, This isn't just HOA abuse. This is extortion, and it's a felony. Curtis felt something shift inside him, the same calm focus he'd experienced before difficult missions overseas. Bethany had picked the wrong target. She thought she was bullying a single father who'd backed down to protect his daughter. Instead, she'd declared war on someone who knew how to fight back. "Margaret, I'm going to need your help with something, and we're going to need to be very, very careful about how we handle this." The crunch of gravel outside announced another car in his driveway. Through the window, Curtis saw Bethany returning, this time with someone who looked distinctly like a lawyer. Round 2 was about to begin. Bethany's lawyer turned out to be exactly what Curtis expected: expensive suit, patronizing smile, and a briefcase full of legal threats designed to intimidate. What he probably didn't expect was to find Curtis sitting calmly at his kitchen table with Margaret and a stack of evidence that could end Bethany's little empire. "Mr. Manning, I'm attorney Bradley Hutchinson representing the Meadowview Heights HOA," the lawyer announced, settling his considerable bulk into Curtis's patio chair. "We need to resolve this situation before it escalates further." Bethany stood behind him like a general directing troops, her earlier nervousness replaced by smug confidence. Clearly, she thought bringing legal firepower would force Curtis to cave. "I understand you've made some concerning allegations about board procedures," Hutchinson continued, opening his briefcase with theatrical precision. "Mrs. Ashford is prepared to reduce your fines to $200 as a goodwill gesture, provided you remove the unauthorized structures within 48 hours. Curtis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he poured himself coffee, noting how the rich aroma seemed to irritate Bethany's already frayed nerves. Margaret smiled quietly beside him, organizing documents with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 40 years in legal work. "Mr. Hutchinson, before we discuss resolutions, I think you should know what we've discovered about your client's business practices." Curtis slid a folder across the table. "These are bank records showing cash deposits totaling $23,000 over 6 months, all from homeowners who received violation notices that were subsequently withdrawn." Hutchinson's confident expression flickered as he scanned the documents. Curtis had spent his Army career reading people under pressure, and the lawyer's micro-expressions told him everything he needed to know. "I also have signed affidavits from 4 residents describing Mrs. Ashford's consultation services," Curtis continued. "Apparently, paying her $500 guarantees your property suddenly becomes compliant with HOA standards." "This is harassment," Bethany snapped, but her voice cracked slightly. "You're stalking residents, intimidating them into signing false statements." Margaret leaned forward with the patience of a predator. "Actually, they contacted us after learning about Curtis's situation. Seems word travels fast in a community of 847 homes when someone finally stands up to extortion." The sound of ice clinking in glasses drifted from the neighbor's backyard barbecue. Normal suburban sounds that felt surreal given the high-stakes confrontation happening at Curtis's patio table. Hutchinson cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "Even if these allegations had merit, which I'm not conceding, the HOA has legitimate authority to enforce architectural standards." "Absolutely," Curtis agreed, "but only within legal boundaries. Arizona Revised Statute 33-1804 requires HOA enforcement to be consistent and non-discriminatory. Selective enforcement, especially when motivated by financial gain, violates both state law and the Fair Housing Act." Curtis had done more than just research. He'd consulted with a friend from his security business who specialized in civil rights law. The knowledge nugget here was crucial. HOAs can't pick and choose which rules to enforce based on personal profit. Any pattern of discriminatory enforcement can trigger federal civil rights violations, which carry serious penalties. "You're also facing potential RICO charges," Margaret added casually, dropping the nuclear option. "Racketeering laws apply when someone uses an organization to conduct ongoing criminal activity, Mrs. Ashford's consulting business meets that definition." Hutchinson's face went pale. RICO charges meant federal prosecution, asset forfeiture, and prison time. Bethany, apparently not understanding the gravity, doubled down instead of backing off. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "I've helped residents understand compliance requirements. That's not illegal." "Taking money to make violations disappear is extortion," Curtis said flatly. "Taking money to avoid violations in the first place is bribery. Both are felonies." The lawyer was furiously scribbling notes. clearly trying to calculate how to extract his client from an increasingly dangerous legal position. But Bethany's next move proved she was too arrogant to recognize when she'd lost. "Fine, you want to play hardball?" Her voice had turned venomous. "Every medical device, every modification, every piece of therapy equipment gets red tagged as a safety violation. I'll have county inspectors here tomorrow declaring this property uninhabitable." Curtis felt something cold settle in his chest. Threatening his daughter's medical equipment crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Emma needed that equipment to maintain her independence and health. "Mrs. Ashford, you just made this personal," Curtis said quietly, "and you just confessed to planning retaliatory enforcement which violates both state fair housing laws and ADA protections." Hutchinson was already packing his briefcase. "Bethany, we need to discuss this privately, immediately." But the damage was done. Bethany had revealed her true intentions, and Curtis had recorded every word on the security system she didn't know about. The audio quality was crystal clear, capturing her threats to weaponize county inspectors against a disabled teenager. As they left, Curtis turned to Margaret. "Time for phase 2. "What's phase 2? Curtis smiled grimly. "We go on the offensive." Curtis woke up Friday morning to find an orange notice plastered across his front door. "Emergency Safety Inspection, County Building Department." Bethany had made good on her threat, somehow fast-tracking an inspection that typically took weeks to schedule. The notice demanded immediate access to inspect reported safety violations regarding unauthorized medical equipment installations. True to his military training, Curtis had anticipated this move. He'd spent the previous evening calling in favors from his contractor network, ensuring Emma's therapy equipment was not just up to code but exceeded safety requirements by a wide margin. But Bethany's real mistake was underestimating how county bureaucracy actually worked. At 8 a.m. sharp, Inspector Rodriguez arrived, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who Curtis immediately recognized as a fellow veteran from the Marine Corps decal on her truck. Behind her came Bethany with another man Curtis didn't recognize, someone trying too hard to look official. "Mr. Manning, I'm here about an emergency inspection request. Have to say, this is unusual. Someone called in claiming immediate safety hazards, but the paperwork seems incomplete." Rodriguez's tone suggested she'd dealt with HOA drama before. Curtis invited her in, noting how Bethany hung back nervously while her companion, who Curtis now suspected wasn't a real inspector, fumbled with a clipboard. "Inspector Rodriguez, I appreciate you coming out. All of my daughter's medical equipment was installed by certified medical equipment specialists with proper permits and county approval." Curtis handed her a 3-ring binder. "Complete documentation, including electrical certifications and ADA compliance reports." Rodriguez flipped through the documentation with professional thoroughness. The sweet scent of Emma's physical therapy lotion lingered in the hallway as they examined the pool lift system, equipment that had quite literally given Emma her mobility back after years of declining strength. "This is actually beautiful work," Rodriguez said, testing the lift mechanism. "Medical-grade installation, proper electrical isolation, emergency shutoffs. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." "I did the electrical work myself," Curtis said. 20 years maintaining military communications equipment, then 10 years in civilian security systems. Got all the proper licenses before starting." Here's where things got interesting. Rodriguez turned to Bethany's companion. "Sir, are you a licensed building inspector? I don't have any record of a joint inspection request." The man's face flushed. I work with Mrs. Ashford on compliance issues." "That's not an answer to my question," Rodriguez said with the authority of someone who'd dealt with wannabe inspectors before. "In Arizona, representing yourself as a building inspector without proper certification is a Class 6 felony. Are you claiming to be an inspector?" Bethany stepped forward quickly. "He's my architectural consultant. I requested the inspection based on safety concerns reported by neighbors." Rodriguez's expression shifted from professional to skeptical. "Ma'am, false reporting of safety violations is also illegal. Were you aware that making fraudulent emergency inspection requests wastes county resources and can result in fines up to $5,000? This was Curtis's knowledge nugget moment. Arizona law specifically protects homeowners from harassment through false code enforcement reports. Filing fake emergency inspections can result in criminal charges and civil liability for the person making false reports. The sound of Emma's wheelchair approaching made everyone turn. She'd been listening from the kitchen, and Curtis could see the worry in her eyes despite her attempt at a brave smile. "Inspector, Would you like me to demonstrate the equipment so you can verify it's working properly? Emma asked with the maturity that constantly amazed Curtis. Rodriguez's expression softened immediately. That would be very helpful, honey. Emma's demonstration was flawless, showing how the lift operated, explaining the safety features, even discussing how the pool temperature monitoring helped with her therapy regimen. Rodriguez asked technical questions that Emma answered with the expertise of someone whose life depended on understanding her equipment. Well, this is clearly a medical necessity, properly installed and maintained, Rodriguez concluded. Mr. Manning, your installation exceeds county requirements. Mrs. Ashford, I'm concerned about the nature of your complaint. These systems are clearly essential medical equipment, not safety hazards. Bethany's fake inspector had quietly retreated to the car, but she pressed on with increasing desperation. What about the unauthorized structural modifications? The ramp changes the building footprint. The ramp has proper permits and ADA compliance certification, Rodriguez replied firmly. Mrs. Ashford, I'm required to file a report about this inspection. I'll be noting that the emergency request appears to have been made in bad faith, potentially as harassment of a disabled resident. The crunch of gravel under nervous pacing filled the silence as Bethany realized her gambit had backfired spectacularly. Not only had she failed to find violations, she'd created a paper trail of her own misconduct with a county official. After Rodriguez left, Curtis found a voicemail from Margaret. 3 more residents had come forward with evidence of Bethany's extortion scheme, including recorded phone calls. But more importantly, Margaret had discovered something that would change everything. Curtis, you need to sit down for this. Margaret's voice was excited, but grim. I found Bethany's business license for her consulting company. She's been operating without proper registration, not reporting income, and here's the kicker. She's been billing some homeowners through fake invoices claiming county inspection fees. Curtis smiled grimly. Bethany had just graduated from simple extortion to mail fraud, tax evasion, and impersonating government services. Federal crimes with federal penalties. The war was about to escalate dramatically. Margaret's call came at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the fake inspection incident. Curtis was helping Emma with her math homework when his phone buzzed with a text that simply said, "Get to my house now, bring coffee, you're going to need it." 20 minutes later, Curtis sat in Margaret's cluttered home office, surrounded by boxes of documents, laptop screens, and the kind of controlled chaos that comes from serious investigative work. The smell of fresh printer ink hung in the air as Margaret fed pages through her scanner with methodical precision. Curtis, remember how I said Bethany was running a simple extortion scheme? I was wrong. This is so much bigger. Margaret's eyes had the gleam of a prosecutor who'd just found the smoking gun. She's not just shaking down homeowners, she's created an entire fake bureaucracy. Margaret spread financial documents across her desk like a general planning an invasion. Bank statements, business registrations, and invoice copies painted a picture that made Curtis's military-trained mind immediately grasp the scope of the operation. Look at this. Margaret pointed to a series of bank deposits. Bethany registered Meadowview Compliance Services as a legitimate business. But here's where it gets criminal. She's been sending homeowners official-looking invoices for mandatory county compliance inspections at $500 each. Curtis studied the invoices. They looked official, complete with county seals, official-sounding reference numbers, and language designed to make homeowners think they were required government fees. These aren't real county inspections, Curtis said, understanding immediately. Exactly. She created fake county inspection requirements, then charged residents to avoid violations that didn't exist. But wait, it gets worse. Margaret pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. She's collected over $185,000 in the past 2 years through this scheme. The number hit Curtis like a physical blow. $185,000 stolen from his neighbors through an elaborate con game that preyed on people's fear of government bureaucracy and HOA retaliation. How many people fell for this? 47 homeowners that I can document, mostly elderly residents and people with disabilities who couldn't afford legal fights. Margaret's voice carried the controlled anger of someone who'd spent her career fighting for justice. She targeted the most vulnerable residents, people who couldn't easily research whether these inspections were legitimate. Margaret showed Curtis copied checks, each one made out to Meadowview Compliance Services, for amounts ranging from $300 to $750. The victims read like a who's who of the community's most vulnerable residents: elderly widows, disabled veterans, single parents, immigrants with limited English. Here's the beautiful part, Margaret continued. By creating fake government documents and using county seals without authorization, she committed federal mail fraud. Each invoice mailed to a victim is a separate federal felony carrying up to 20 years in prison. Curtis felt pieces clicking into place. So the HOA violations were just the collection mechanism. She'd threaten people with expensive citation battles, then offer her inspection service as the easier solution. Right. Pay $500 for a fake inspection that shows you're compliant or face thousands in violation fines and legal battles. Most people chose the inspection. Margaret pulled out a recording device. But here's our smoking gun. Mrs. Clara from Maple Street recorded her phone conversation with Bethany. The recording was damning. Bethany's voice clearly explained how paying for the compliance inspection would ensure no future violations would be found, and how residents who didn't participate faced increased scrutiny from county officials. She even explicitly mentioned how she had special relationships with inspectors. Mrs. Clara paid because her English isn't perfect and she was terrified of dealing with government bureaucracy, Margaret said. Bethany specifically targeted non-native speakers because they were less likely to question the legitimacy of the charges. Curtis ran the numbers quickly. 47 victims, $185,000 stolen, federal mail fraud charges, fake government documents, targeted harassment of protected classes. This wasn't just extortion anymore. This was organized crime with federal implications. Margaret, we need to contact the FBI. Already did. Agent Sarah Collins from the Phoenix field office specializes in public corruption cases. She's very interested in our evidence. Margaret smiled grimly. Bethany picked the wrong neighborhood to run her con. Curtis thought about Emma, about Mrs. Clara, about all the neighbors who'd been terrorized and robbed by someone who was supposed to serve their community. The anger he felt was cold and focused, the kind that had made him an effective soldier and would now make him a dangerous enemy. What's our next move? We gather the rest of the evidence, then we spring the trap. But Curtis, once we start this process, Bethany's going to get desperate. Desperate people do stupid things. Curtis smiled grimly. Good, let her get stupid. Stupid people make mistakes. The next phase of Curtis's operation required the kind of methodical planning he'd learned dismantling terrorist networks in Afghanistan. But instead of hunting insurgents, he was building an airtight case against a suburban con artist who'd stolen nearly $200,000 from his neighbors. Curtis's garage had been transformed into a command center. Pegboards lined the walls, displaying photos, documents, and a timeline that mapped Bethany's crimes with military precision. The scent of fresh coffee competed with the metallic smell of electrical components as Curtis worked on his most important project, a security fence that would be both legal and impossible to circumvent. Emma, hand me that voltage meter, Curtis called out as his daughter wheeled over with tools organized in military-style efficiency. She'd become his unofficial operations coordinator, helping catalog evidence with the detail-oriented mind she'd inherited from her father. Dad, Agent Collins called. She wants to review our evidence package tomorrow. Emma's voice carried a mix of excitement and nervousness. Working with the FBI was serious business, even for a teenager who'd grown up around her father's security work. The fence installation was proceeding exactly as Curtis had planned. Arizona law was crystal clear. Property owners had the right to install security measures on their own land, provided they included proper warning signs and didn't create hazards for emergency services. Curtis's design exceeded all legal requirements while creating something Bethany couldn't ignore or circumvent. The perimeter fence stood 8 feet high, topped with 3 strands of electrified wire carrying 10,000 volts, enough to deliver a memorable shock without causing permanent injury. Warning signs every 6 feet announced danger, high-voltage electric fence, in English and Spanish, with Curtis's contact information for any questions. The beauty of this system, Curtis explained to Margaret as they reviewed the installation, is that it's completely legal and absolutely impossible to disable without specialized equipment. The voltage is non-lethal but unforgettable. Margaret studied the technical specifications Curtis had provided. And you're certain this complies with all local codes? Better than compliant. The electrical work exceeds commercial security standards. Curtis pointed to the control panel. Motion sensors, cameras with infrared capability, and audio recording. Anyone who touches this fence gets documented from 6 different angles. Here's the key knowledge nugget Curtis had learned from his security business. Arizona's purple paint law allows property owners to mark their boundaries with purple paint instead of no trespassing signs. Combined with proper electric fence warning signs, This creates an ironclad legal defense against trespassing claims. Translation: if someone gets shocked by a properly marked electric fence on private property, they have zero legal recourse for damages. The fence served multiple purposes beyond security. Its placement carefully encompassed the utility easement area where Bethany's fake inspectors had been trespassing, the backyard where she'd been photographing Emma's equipment, and the side yard where HOA violations were typically measured. Anyone attempting to conduct unauthorized inspections would have to breach obvious security barriers. Curtis had also been busy building alliances. The 47 victims of Bethany's scam had formed an informal coalition, sharing evidence and coordinating their responses. Mrs. Clara had become an unexpected leader, her broken English hiding a steel determination to see justice served. "Many of us, we think HOA problems normal," Mrs. Clara had explained during one of their kitchen table meetings. "In my country, officials take money all the time. Here's supposed to be different. We fight back now." Agent Collins had been impressed by the quality of evidence Curtis's group had compiled. Bank records, recorded phone calls, fake invoices, witness statements, enough material to build multiple federal cases. But she'd also warned them about the dangers of pursuing someone facing serious criminal charges. "People get unpredictable when they realize they're looking at 20 years in federal prison," Collins had said. "Mrs. Ashford might try to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, or even flee. You need to be prepared for escalation." Curtis's military experience had taught him that preparation meant anticipating every possible enemy response. He'd installed additional security cameras, created backup copies of all evidence stored in multiple locations, and established communication protocols with other victims. The financial aspect was equally important. Curtis had consulted with a civil rights attorney who specialized in HOA abuse cases. The lawyer explained how Bethany's selective enforcement created liability for both her personally and the HOA board that had enabled her actions. Federal civil rights violations carry automatic attorney fees for successful plaintiffs, the attorney had explained, plus punitive damages that could easily reach 6 figures. Mrs. Ashford isn't just looking at criminal charges, she's facing financial ruin. Emma had suggested the most elegant touch: a small sign next to the fence's main gate reading, "Security system installed for protection against HOA harassment." Perfectly legal, completely factual, and guaranteed to infuriate Bethany every time she saw it. By the 3rd week of planning, Curtis's trap was set. Motion sensors armed, cameras recording, documentation complete. All he needed now was for Bethany to make her next move. He didn't have to wait long. Bethany's desperation became obvious on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in late June when she arrived at Curtis's house with what appeared to be a small army. 2 unmarked vans, 4 men in generic security uniforms, and a woman with an expensive briefcase who radiated the predatory confidence of high-priced legal muscle. Curtis watched the convoy arrive through his security monitors, feeling the familiar calm that came before decisive action. Emma was safely at her friend's house for a scheduled sleepover. Curtis had started ensuring she was elsewhere whenever Bethany escalated tensions. "Mr. Manning," Bethany's voice carried across the yard with forced authority. "I'm here with emergency building inspectors and county health officials. Your illegal modifications have been reported as creating neighborhood health hazards." Curtis stepped onto his front porch, noting immediately that none of Bethany's officials carried proper identification, county vehicles, or legitimate inspection equipment. The acrid smell of diesel fumes from the idling vans mixed with the desert heat, creating an atmosphere of manufactured urgency. "Ma'am, I'll need to see county identification and inspection warrants before anyone enters my property," Curtis replied calmly, his phone already recording video. The woman with the briefcase stepped forward. "I'm attorney Victoria Clara, yes, relation to your neighbor, representing Meadowview Compliance Services. We have documented health violations that require immediate inspection." Curtis almost smiled at the audacity. Bethany had hired Mrs. Clara's daughter to intimidate the same woman she'd been extorting. The family connection was supposed to create psychological pressure, but it actually confirmed how desperate Bethany had become. "Ms. Clara, your client is currently under federal investigation for mail fraud, extortion, and impersonating government officials. I'd strongly advise you to research your client's background before proceeding." The lawyer's confident expression flickered slightly. Clearly, Bethany hadn't mentioned the federal investigation when retaining counsel. "These men need access to inspect your electrical modifications," one of the fake inspectors announced, pointing toward the fence. We have reports of dangerous voltage levels in violation of county codes. Here's where Curtis sprung his first surprise. Gentlemen, this fence was installed by Morrison Security Solutions. That's my company. With all proper permits and county approvals. He handed copies through the fence gate. Inspector Rodriguez signed off on the electrical work personally. You're welcome to verify that with her directly. The fake inspectors exchanged uncertain glances. They'd clearly expected to intimidate a homeowner who didn't understand electrical codes, not encounter someone who'd built his career on security installations. The fence voltage exceeds residential safety standards, the lead fake inspector insisted. Actually, it doesn't. Curtis pointed to the specification plate mounted prominently on the fence. Arizona Administrative Code R430301 allows security fencing up to 10,000 volts on residential property with proper signage and non-lethal current settings. This system operates at exactly 9,500 volts with pulse-limited current. Margaret had taught Curtis another valuable lesson about dealing with fake officials. Real inspectors know the codes intimately and can discuss technical specifications in detail. Fake inspectors rely on intimidation and vague authority claims because they don't actually understand the regulations they claim to enforce. Look, just let us in to check the equipment, one of Bethany's men said, reaching toward the gate latch. Sir, I wouldn't do that, Curtis warned. That fence is electrified and will deliver a significant shock. The warning signs are clearly posted. The man paused, hand inches from the latch, suddenly realizing Curtis wasn't bluffing about the voltage. Bethany's frustration finally boiled over. This is ridiculous! Curtis, you're creating a public nuisance with this fence. The HOA board is prepared to file for an emergency injunction to have it removed. Actually, Bethany, the HOA board voted last night to suspend your authority pending the FBI investigation, Curtis replied calmly. I have the meeting minutes right here. The color drained from Bethany's face. Curtis's coalition had been busy over the past week, attending HOA meetings and presenting evidence to board members who had no idea about their chair's criminal activities. Faced with potential legal liability for enabling Bethany's schemes, the board had acted quickly to distance themselves. That's impossible. I would have been notified. Check your email, Margaret said, emerging from Curtis's house with a laptop. The notification was sent to all board members at 11:47 p.m. last night, including a formal request for your resignation. The fake legal team was clearly unprepared for this development. Attorney Clara was frantically checking her phone, probably trying to verify her client's authority to hire legal representation for HOA matters. Curtis decided to twist the knife. Ms. Clara, you might want to know that the FBI has frozen Meadowview Compliance Services bank accounts pending their investigation. I'm not sure how your retainer checks will clear. The lawyer's expression went from confident to concerned to alarmed in about 3 seconds. Nothing ruins a lawyer's day like discovering their client can't pay legal fees. As Bethany's army of fake officials retreated to regroup, Curtis knew the next escalation would be her most dangerous move yet. Bethany's final gambit came 3 nights later at 2:17 a.m. when Curtis's security system detected movement along his fence perimeter. The motion sensors triggered silently, recording everything in high-definition infrared as 2 figures dressed in dark clothing approached his property with what appeared to be bolt cutters and a small crowbar. Curtis had been expecting this. Desperate people facing federal prison time don't typically surrender quietly, especially someone with Bethany's inflated sense of entitlement. From his bedroom window, he watched her direct a younger man, probably her son, toward the fence's electrical control panel. The irony was perfect. After months of trespassing on his property to fabricate violations, Bethany was now committing actual criminal trespass to destroy evidence of her own crimes. Curtis's military training had taught him that enemies often defeated themselves by abandoning legal strategy in favor of obviously illegal desperation. "Dad, is that them?" Emma whispered from her doorway, fully awake despite the early hour. Curtis had prepared her for this possibility, explaining how cornered criminals often escalated to property damage or intimidation. "Yes, sweetheart, but everything's going exactly as planned." Curtis activated his recording system, ensuring multiple cameras captured every angle of Bethany's attempted sabotage. "Call Agent Collins and give her the code phrase we discussed." Emma disappeared to make the call while Curtis watched Bethany's son approach the electrical control panel. The young man clearly had no idea what he was dealing with. He reached confidently for the main shutoff switch, apparently thinking he could simply turn off the power and climb the fence. The 9,500-volt shock knocked him backward 3 feet, sending bolt cutters flying and eliciting a yelp that probably woke half the neighborhood. Security lighting immediately flooded the area, triggered by the system's tamper detection protocols. "Jason, are you okay?" Bethany's frantic voice carried clearly through the night air, her attempted stealth operation now completely blown. "Mom, what the hell? You said it was just decorative lighting." Jason sat up slowly, shaking his head and examining his slightly singed gloves. Curtis smiled grimly. Bethany had lied to her own son about the fence's capabilities, sending him in completely unprepared for what he'd encounter. The conversation was being recorded by multiple microphones, providing perfect evidence of her intent to commit property damage. The sound of sirens in the distance announced Agent Collins' arrival. Curtis had coordinated with the FBI to ensure federal agents responded to any escalation attempts, since Bethany's crimes fell under federal jurisdiction. "This is Agent Collins, FBI. I need everyone to remain calm and keep their hands visible." Collins' voice cut through the night with professional authority as she emerged from an unmarked SUV, followed by 2 other agents and 2 county sheriff's deputies. Bethany's panic was immediate and obvious. "There's been a misunderstanding. We were just checking for safety hazards with the fence installation." "Ma'am, at 2 a.m., while carrying bolt cutters and wearing dark clothing?" Deputy Martinez had the weary tone of someone who'd heard every possible excuse. "And your son just received an electrical shock from attempting to tamper with private property?" Collins approached Curtis's front door while other agents secured the scene. "Mr. Manning, we're going to need your security footage and any other documentation of tonight's incident." "Already prepared, Agent Collins." Curtis handed her a USB drive containing the night's recordings plus comprehensive documentation of Bethany's escalating harassment. Everything from motion detection through attempted property damage, including audio of Mrs. Ashford directing her son to disable my security system. Jason was now standing, looking increasingly confused and angry as he realized his mother had manipulated him into committing a crime. "Mom, you told me we were just checking if his fence was legal. You never said anything about disabling security systems." "Shut up, Jason," Bethany hissed, finally revealing the ugly personality she'd hidden behind suburban pleasantries. Collins studied the recordings on Curtis's security monitor, her expression growing more satisfied with each frame. "Mrs. Ashford, you're under arrest for criminal trespass, attempted destruction of property, and conspiracy to interfere with a federal investigation." The sound of handcuffs clicking seemed unnaturally loud in the desert night air. Bethany's transformation from neighborhood authority figure to federal criminal was complete, witnessed by the growing crowd of neighbors who'd been awakened by the commotion. "This is entrapment," Bethany screamed as agents escorted her toward their vehicle. "He built that fence specifically to trap me." "Actually, ma'am, entrapment requires law enforcement to induce someone to commit a crime they wouldn't normally commit," Collins explained patiently. "Installing legal security measures on private property isn't entrapment. Choosing to trespass and attempt sabotage is entirely your decision." As the FBI vehicles disappeared into the night, Curtis felt the satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. Bethany had been caught red-handed committing federal crimes, with her own words documenting her criminal intent. But the best part was still to come. In 12 hours, the entire neighborhood would gather for an emergency HOA meeting where the scope of Bethany's crimes would be revealed publicly. Justice was about to be served with an audience. The Meadowview Heights Community Center had never hosted a crowd like the one that gathered Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Word of Bethany's midnight arrest had spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a high school reunion, and every available chair was filled with residents demanding answers. Curtis arrived early with Emma, Margaret, and Mrs. Clara carrying boxes of documentation that would transform neighborhood speculation into documented fact. The smell of fresh coffee from the community kitchen mixed with nervous tension as people whispered about FBI raids, criminal charges, and the shocking revelation that their HOA chair was a federal criminal. Agent Collins stood at the front of the room alongside the remaining HOA board members, who looked like deer caught in headlights. Behind them, a projection screen displayed the FBI's official seal, a visual reminder that this wasn't typical HOA drama. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this emergency meeting," board member Patricia Donovan began nervously. "We're here to address recent developments regarding former board chair Bethany Ashford." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The word former carried weight that wasn't lost on anyone present. Agent Collins stepped forward with the calm authority of someone who delivered similar presentations dozens of times. I'm FBI Special Agent Sarah Collins. Over the past month, our office has conducted an investigation into allegations of mail fraud, extortion, and racketeering involving Mrs. Ashford's activities as HOA chair. The room fell dead silent. Curtis could hear the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of children playing in the park outside, normal suburban sounds that felt surreal given the federal criminal presentation happening inside. The investigation began when Mr. Curtis Manning contacted our office with evidence of systematic extortion targeting vulnerable residents, Collins continued, gesturing toward Curtis. What we discovered was an elaborate criminal scheme that victimized 47 homeowners and generated approximately $185,000 in illegal proceeds. Collins activated the projection system, displaying Bethany's fake invoices for mandatory county compliance inspections. The forged county seals and official-sounding language looked even more obviously fraudulent when projected on a large screen. Mrs. Ashford created a fake business entity called Meadowview Compliance Services and used official HOA letterhead to convince residents they needed to pay for government inspections that didn't exist, Collins explained. She specifically targeted elderly residents, disabled homeowners, and non-native English speakers who were less likely to question the legitimacy of these charges. Mrs. Clara stood up slowly, her voice trembling but determined. I pay $500 because I scared of government trouble. My English not perfect, so I believe when official-looking papers say I must pay for inspection. She know I afraid, and she take advantage. The emotional impact was immediate and powerful. Curtis watched neighbors who'd remained silent about their own victimization finally understand they weren't alone. Hands began raising around the room as other residents prepared to share similar experiences. Mr. Thompson on Oak Street, what about your experience? Margaret called out, recognizing another documented victim. She told me my rose garden needed a $750 compliance inspection or the county would fine me $5,000, Thompson said angrily. I paid because I couldn't afford a legal battle. Never occurred to me it was all fake. Collins continued her presentation with the methodical precision of someone building a federal case. The evidence includes recorded phone calls, bank records, forged government documents, and surveillance footage. Last night, Mrs. Ashford was arrested attempting to destroy evidence by sabotaging Mr. Manning's security system. The crowd's murmur grew louder as people processed the scope of Bethany's criminality. This wasn't just HOA overreach, it was organized crime that had operated in their neighborhood for over 2 years. What happens to our money? Called out Mrs. Rodriguez from the back row. Asset forfeiture laws allow us to recover proceeds from criminal activity, Collins replied. Mrs. Ashford's assets, including her house and bank accounts, will be liquidated to provide restitution to victims. We expect full recovery of stolen funds plus additional damages. Curtis stood to address the crowd, feeling the weight of 47 families who'd trusted him to seek justice. Folks, this started because Bethany tried to force my disabled daughter and me out of our home through fake violations and extortion. But it became about something bigger, making sure no one else gets victimized by people who abuse positions of trust. Emma wheeled forward, her young voice carrying remarkable strength. My dad taught me that standing up to bullies isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting everyone who can't fight back. The applause was immediate and sustained, growing into a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. Curtis felt tears in his eyes as he watched his daughter receive the recognition she deserved for her courage throughout the ordeal. Bethany Ashford will face federal charges carrying potential sentences of up to 20 years in prison, Collins concluded. Her criminal scheme is over, and your community is safe. As neighbors lined up to thank Curtis and share their own stories, he realized justice felt even better than revenge. 6 months later, Curtis Manning stood in his backyard watching Emma demonstrate her therapy pool to a group of visiting veterans' families. The morning sun reflected off the water's surface as she explained how the resistance exercises helped maintain her strength and mobility, the same equipment Bethany had tried to force them to remove. The legal aftermath had unfolded exactly as Agent Collins predicted. Bethany pleaded guilty to 14 federal felony counts, including mail fraud, extortion, racketeering, and tax evasion. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison and ordered her to pay $247,000 in restitution, the $185,000 she'd stolen plus additional damages and penalties. Her house had been sold at auction to satisfy the restitution order, with every victimized resident receiving full compensation plus interest. Mrs. Clara had used her settlement to take English classes at the community college, determined that language barriers would never again make her vulnerable to con artists. The HOA had undergone complete restructuring under court supervision. New bylaws required financial transparency, prohibited selective enforcement, and established an independent oversight committee with rotating membership. Most importantly, they'd hired a professional management company with fiduciary insurance and federal compliance expertise. "Dad, Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if you can install a security system like ours," Emma called out from the pool. "Her family's moving into the Ashford house next month and she wants to feel safe." Curtis smiled, wiping his hands on his work shirt. His security business had exploded after word spread about his successful defense against HOA harassment. Veterans' families, elderly residents, and immigrant communities throughout Phoenix were hiring Morrison Security Solutions to protect their homes and their rights. The sweet scent of Emma's therapy lotion mixed with chlorine and the desert air as Curtis organized his tools. Every morning brought calls from homeowners facing similar situations: HOA abuse, neighbor harassment, or property rights violations. Curtis had become something of a local legend, the guy who'd taken down a federal criminal and protected his community. Margaret had channeled her paralegal expertise into founding the Arizona HOA Abuse Prevention Network, providing free legal resources and advocacy for residents facing harassment. The organization had already helped dozens of families challenge improper fines, selective enforcement, and discriminatory practices. "Curtis, Channel 12 News wants to interview you next week about the legislation," Margaret called from his patio, where she was organizing files for their latest case. The state legislature was considering the Ashford Act, new laws strengthening penalties for HOA fraud and creating stronger protections for disabled residents. Agent Collins had become a regular visitor, consulting with Curtis's team on similar cases across the Southwest. Bethany's scheme had been replicated by corrupt HOA officials in 3 other states, leading to a federal task force targeting HOA-related organized crime. The most satisfying development was watching Emma flourish in an environment where she felt safe and supported. Her confidence had grown tremendously since the ordeal ended, and she'd become an advocate for disability rights in her high school. The debate team trophy on Curtis's mantle reminded him daily that his daughter was thriving despite, or perhaps because of, the challenges they'd overcome together. "Mr. Manning?" A new voice interrupted his thoughts. A young mother with tired eyes stood at his gate with a folder of papers. "I'm Sarah Kim from Sunset Ridge HOA. My neighbor said you might be able to help. Our board is trying to force us to remove my son's autism swing set, and they're threatening foreclosure." Curtis felt the familiar stirring of controlled anger. Somewhere in the valley, another family was being terrorized by petty tyrants who thought a clipboard gave them the right to destroy lives. But now Curtis had resources, experience, and a network of allies ready to fight back. "Come on in, Mrs. Kim. Let's take a look at what they've sent you." Curtis opened his gate, noting how the woman's shoulders relaxed slightly when she saw Emma's therapy equipment and the American flag flying next to Curtis's "Protected by Morrison Security" sign. Emma wheeled over from the pool, water still dripping from her exercise session. "Mrs. Kim, my dad's really good at dealing with bullies, and we know some FBI agents if things get really bad." As Curtis settled into another battle for justice, he reflected on how far they'd come. Emma had her safety and stability. The neighborhood had learned that corruption could be defeated by ordinary people willing to document evidence and work together. And Curtis had found his calling protecting families from the kind of harassment they'd endured. The phone rang again. Another family needing help, another chance to prove that standing up to bullies made communities stronger. Curtis smiled and answered the call. "Morrison Security Solutions. How can we help?"
Thanks for hanging out with us on HOA Stories, where the HOA Karens meet their match. If this story had you cheering or cringing, go ahead and like the video, drop a comment with your reaction, and hit subscribe so you're ready for the next wild HOA tale.